We'll now get ourselves ready and organized and for question period to begin momentarily. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. The government has introduced a cap-and-trade system that has no actual environmental goals. Instead, it only has pricing goals, $10 to $50 per tonne of emissions, Mr. Speaker. That price will be applied to everyday items like gasoline and home heating fuel. I've repeatedly asked the Premier how much more his cap-and-trade system will cost Nova Scotia households, and all he has said is that his new system will, I quote, protect the pocketbooks of Nova Scotians. So I would like to know what that means, Mr. Speaker. Will the Premier be clear? Will the cost of gasoline and home heating fuel go up, go down, or stay the same under his plan?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, our plan will protect the pocketbooks of Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, prices can either go up or they can go down or they can stay the same. I'm not sure which option the Premier just indicated, but Nova Scotians deserve to know, Mr. Speaker, if the cost of everyday items like heating their home, like driving to work, is going to go up or not, Mr. Speaker. And manufacturers need to know, Mr. Speaker, important employers in this province, like Michelin, like Oxford Frozen Fuels, they did the right thing a few years ago when they converted to natural gas. Now natural gas is going to be subject to the cap-and-trade rules as well, Mr. Speaker. They are going to be penalised for having done the right thing for the environment in the first place. And I want to know from the Premier, why does he think it's okay for important employers like Michelin, like Oxford Frozen Foods, to now be penalised for having done the right thing and converted to natural gas?
The Honourable Premier.
Again, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable for the question. And in his preamble, Mr. Speaker, he had a lot of assumptions which are completely wrong, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is we brought a cap-and-trade system into this province that is unique to Nova Scotia and reflects the hard work of all Nova Scotians over the last decade, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue to make sure that we defend the interests of all Nova Scotians when it comes to ensuring that we continue to reduce our greenhouse gas production. We know by 2030 we'll be 50% below where we were in 2005-6, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue to work with Nova Scotians, continue to lead this country in greenhouse gas reductions, but at the same time, Mr. Speaker, we're going to protect their pocketbooks.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Speaker, no one knows what that means. Of course we're making assumptions because the government is not clear. Are the cost of these items going to go up or down? Are our manufacturers going to have increased costs or not, Mr. Speaker? No wonder there is such confusion when the government is expecting Nova Scotians to buy a pig in a poke that they aren't entitled to know the answers to these very basic questions, Mr. Speaker. I mean, look at it. Here we have a system where no one is allowed to know how much it costs. It contains no actual new environmental targets, Mr. Speaker, and the government itself doesn't even know who is going to be included. In estimates in this House, Mr. Speaker, agriculture was very clear that they're totally exempt from cap-and-trade. Environment came into the same place and said they were actually included, Mr. Speaker. No wonder there is so much confusion. How can the Premier expect Nova Scotians to buy into a program when they are given so little information to go by?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman for the question. Again, I want to thank all those Nova Scotians over the last decade to continue to work to reduce our greenhouse gas production. Mr. Speaker, if you look at in our province, successive governments have used regulation, Mr. Speaker, which has driven great results. We wanted to make sure that when Ottawa continued to implement this price on carbon across the country, that the hard work by Nova Scotians was reflected in the fact that all of the work that had happened over the last decade, Mr. Speaker, would still be there. The Nova Scotians could use that to smooth it out across our sectors. The honourable member would know in British Columbia they've used a carbon tax. We have not seen any reduction in greenhouse gas production. If you go look at Ontario, they've used their own version of a cap-and-trade system. We've not seen the results that we've seen in this province. What we wanted to make sure is that we continue to work hard on behalf of all Nova Scotians, and we continue to make sure we protect their pocketbooks, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. When questioned recently here in the House, both the Premier and the Minister of Environment said that they have not been lobbied by the Premier's campaign director on behalf of Lafarge Canada. But on the Registry of Lobbyists website, this same campaign director is asked directly, I quote, have you lobbied or do you expect to lobby a member of the House of Assembly in the member's capacity as a member or a person on the member's staff? To which he answered simply yes. So I want to ask the Premier, who then in his government has been lobbied by his campaign director?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know if anyone has. What the honourable member asked me the question, have I been? And the answer is that absolutely not.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, you actually don't need to be a lobbyist in Nova Scotia in order to get inside access to the Premier and his cabinet. You can also just pay $750 a year to join the Angus L Club, as they call it, which the Liberal Party once boasted on its website offers members, I quote, enhanced opportunities to meet with the leader and caucus members, as well as exclusive invitations to special events. So I ask the Premier, at a time when matters of this sort are surrounded with so much ethical controversy, how can he justify taking part in these cash for access arrangements?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I've been lobbied by members on the opposite side of the House, Mr. Speaker, walking into this building looking for projects in their particular ridings, Mr. Speaker, but I can tell the honourable member that I have not been lobbied, Mr. Speaker, by anyone to move a project through. Mr. Speaker, I continue to work on behalf of all Nova Scotians, and like we've continued to do for the last 4 years, Mr. Speaker, when this government makes a decision, it is made based on fact and in the best interest of all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, not a certain group.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on his final supplementary.
Thank you. I think it's possible, Mr. Speaker, that the Premier is failing to recognize the gravity with which this issue is approached by people. Liberals across the country in various jurisdictions have in recent months been criticized for cash for access schemes and fundraisers, and yet in other parts of the country we see that there have been responses to these criticisms. Various jurisdictions have made changes to regulatory systems, but in Nova Scotia the response to these criticisms has been zero. As a matter of fact, the agenda for the Liberals AGM this weekend notes that members of the, I note again, the $750 to join, members of the Angus L Club can go to an exclusive reception Saturday with the Premier and the Liberal caucus. Mr. Speaker, these kinds of cash for access events are below the standard of integrity in government that people have a right to expect. So I want to ask the Premier, will he intervene and cancel the cash for access event scheduled for the Liberal AGM this weekend?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to again thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, I want to continue to know, as he would know, in this province, the campaign donation rules are as strict as they are anywhere in the country. Mr. Speaker, our party is no different than his party or the party across the way from me, the official opposition. Continue to go forward, Mr. Speaker. And I really don't know, and I don't want to question the honourable member, but I don't know of anyone in this House, Mr. Speaker, that's prepared to sell their dignity for $750 and questioning the fact that he think I would be doing it.
The Honourable Leader of the official opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Education. Earlier this year, Nova Scotians were disturbed to learn that videos recorded at a school in Cape Breton made their way into the public domain, apparently hosted by a Russian website, if you can believe that, Mr. Speaker. It turns out those videos were done because of provincial guidelines that require video cameras be placed in our schools for security purposes. And Mr. Speaker, I will say no one would argue with the need for video security in our schools. What we don't know is whether those video cameras, their usage was in compliance with the province's own privacy laws. So I would like to ask the Minister to confirm if in-school video cameras are in fact compliant with the province's own privacy laws.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Obviously a very concerning situation. This was directly related to the security of the password for this one camera. We have since been assured by all boards that the security issue has been dealt with from a password perspective, although the Privacy Commissioner has brought forward recommendations specific to the Cape Breton board, but we are going to look to see if we can expand those recommendations to cover the entire province. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the official opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, today's Privacy Officer report confirms that all school boards in Nova Scotia use the same open, non-secure video system that was the subject of this disturbing occurrence in Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker. Clearly, parents across this province are worried about what's going on in their own schools with their own children in terms of their privacy and video surveillance, Mr. Speaker. So I would like to ask the Minister if he can tell the House how many schools are using the same system and what steps is his department taking to secure those cameras immediately.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Of course, it is very frightening when you see images of our schools show up on a Russian website. This was the result of a hack. We had a weakness in the security because of a password issue. We've since been assured by all boards that that issue has been addressed. We have some very thoughtful and appropriate recommendations that have come forward from the Privacy Commissioner. And although she has made those recommendations specific to Cape Breton, we're going to look at expanding those recommendations province-wide. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. When my daughter was just 2 years old, I worked at a bank. I had to take her to Halifax for a health issue, and my employer told me there was no leave available. As a mother, I took time off without pay, risked my job so that I could make sure my daughter got to that appointment. When I got a unionized job at the hospital, you can imagine my relief knowing that I would have access to paid leave so I could care for my child. When I go into collective bargaining, my job is to speak for all the parents who just want to know that their job will be safe if they need to be home for a day with their child. My question, Mr. Speaker, does the Premier agree that Nova Scotia workers deserve better protections fairly negotiated by their unions?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud of it. Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud of the record of our government continuing to go and work and go back to the bargaining table, getting successive agreements with the negotiating team, some of which have been rejected by their membership, Mr. Speaker. We've continued every step to deliver free and collective bargaining, unlike the party that she represents that drove paramedics back to work.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Actually, that was dictating, not bargaining. Mr. Speaker, the unions in this province represent thousands who are making $15 an hour and doing their best to make life better for themselves and their families. Over the past few days, this Premier has repeatedly stood in this House and tried to use the same divide and conquer strategy on the doctors of this province that he used on the teachers in February. Well, Mr. Speaker, as a former healthcare worker and a proud union member and rep, I've had enough. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier apologize to the unionized members of this province for his comments and complete lack of respect for collective bargaining?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for her question. Mr. Speaker, we just had a campaign called an election campaign. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank those Nova Scotians, both union and non-union, who supported and voted for us, Mr. Speaker. That happened in my riding. Mr. Speaker, I want to remind the Honourable Member, while she prior to being here, no campaigning, she brought up the issue of the NSTU and teachers, Mr. Speaker. There was very clearly teachers were upset. Not just at this government, they were clearly upset at their union, quite frankly. As I go across the province, people have been obviously had issues with the government, Mr. Speaker, at times, but let's be clearly and frank. They're also unhappy with the representation they've had at the union leadership, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is, we've provided what we believe is a fair wage pattern.
The Honourable Premier has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, the facts of the matter is, we provided what we believe is a fair wage pattern. Each and every step, we moved. We adjusted. We provided more, Mr. Speaker. At the end of the day, there are people who didn't feel it was enough. I get that, Mr. Speaker. The responsibility for me, though, is to represent all Nova Scotians, respond to all the needs and desires of every Nova Scotian, Mr. Speaker. The desire of a union leader is to represent the people who are paying the membership fees. They're very different scenarios, and sometimes we don't agree.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Speaker, a question for the Minister of Energy. Mr. Speaker, the proposed cap-and-trade program. We've just heard the Premier indicate that the government is going to protect the pocketbooks of Nova Scotians. So, Mr. Speaker, our leaders just call that a pig in a poke, which I think is the same as a pig in a bag. You don't know what you got until you get home. And as my old friend Cyril Reddy used to say, you might land home from the auction the proud owner of both pieces. It might be broken. So, Mr. Speaker, we're concerned. This is important legislation. Mr. Speaker, it appears that Nova Scotia Power will be exempt from the cap or may be eligible to receive free credits. Is it true that the government plans to exempt Nova Scotia Power from the cap and trade program?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for the question. It is an important one. That actually is not true. Nova Scotia Power will be part of any conversations about cap and trade. The reality is for Nova Scotia Power and the energy it uses and all those large-scale users in the province, they're going to be subject to this, and based on their ability to perform, to use renewables as part of their mix, and to use efficiencies in their energy consumption, is going to make them put them under that cap, and that's where the value comes in for Nova Scotians. So, Mr. Speaker, this is a fair program for everybody. We'll get to the details, but the reality is Nova Scotia is in a great place because of the work we've already done. Thank you.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you can see why we're asking the question. Nova Scotia Power is the province's largest carbon emitter. So if Nova Scotians are going to be protected, if their pocketbooks are going to be protected, how is the government going to do this? Are they going to charge a penalty to Nova Scotia Power's profits that it cannot charge back to the consumer? Is that the plan? Can the minister confirm?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, Nova Scotia Power and other large-scale users of energy and consumers of energy will be subject to this cap and trade system. Those who perform and who stay under the cap will have those credits for free, so to speak. Those who don't will be in that trading mechanism, Mr. Speaker. So at the end of the day, those who will be subject to this legislation will have some work to do in terms of creating efficiencies, in terms of making their operations such that they're using renewables, they're keeping their emissions down, and they're playing a role. But again, we're in a great shape as a province, Mr. Speaker, because of the hard work of Nova Scotians, because of the rate base, because of government policy, years gone by, and certainly with our present mandate, we've put our people in a great position to protect the environment, to make sure that we're not increasing, and in fact, we're largely decreasing in a major way our GHG emissions. We're leaders on this continent, Mr. Speaker, and it's because of the work of the people of this province. Thanks.
The honourable member for Argyll-Barrington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Earlier today I had the opportunity to introduce a number of chiefs and representatives from Métis groups from across Nova Scotia. The Minister of Aboriginal Affairs is, I'm sure, aware of the continuing fight the Métis groups in Nova Scotia have been waging to be recognized as Aboriginals, as their cousins are west of Ontario. So my question to the Premier, who is also Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, has he met with these groups to listen to their challenges?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable for the question. Mr. Speaker, I've not met with these groups. I know some people from, I think, the department have. I believe the member from Digby-Annapolis may have been at an annual meeting or more recently, Mr. Speaker, but the question, have I? No.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Would have hoped to heard that you had a chance to do it, but I will go on. On October 1st, the Premier was sent a letter from a constituent of mine, Chief Tony Cunningham of the Southwest Nova Métis Council, and I'll table it here in the House. It represents a resume of all these ongoing issues. I know it's not the desire of the province of Nova Scotia to negotiate on behalf of the government of Nova Scotia, but these groups are asking for your support to help their communities with education and health care, just like any other community group here in Nova Scotia. So my question is the Minister, Premier, willing to meet and help them with their concerns?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, Mr. Speaker, every minister in this government will work with people to provide the programs that he's referring to that all Nova Scotians should aspire to want for their children and in their community, to continue to help build those communities. Of course, we'll meet with members across the province, Mr. Speaker, but I want to be clear about this to all. It's important that we have this conversation, that the courts have determined the treaty rights and rights-based for the Mi'kmaq of our province, and we're continuing to make sure that we continue to build on that relationship. You're very right. In Western Canada, the Métis have rights that have been granted through the courts, determined by them. We're continuing to work with organizations. It's not up to the Premier to determine that, Mr. Speaker. There's a rule of law, there's a court of law that'll go through that process, but we're prepared, and I'm prepared to work with all community groups to ensure that we deliver on those things. But let's be clear that the courts have determined that the treaty rights in the province of Nova Scotia belong to the Mi'kmaq.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, last week the Minister and the Premier made it plain that they were not in a conflict with doctors, but they had a problem with Doctors Nova Scotia. Well, Mr. Speaker, I can tell all members of this House that the doctors I know can see the difference in that. Section 8 of the Doctors Nova Scotia Act says, for a doctor to practice in Nova Scotia, they shall be a member of Doctors Nova Scotia. And I will table that, Mr. Speaker. So my question is very simple. Will the minister acknowledge that doctors make up Doctors Nova Scotia, and when he has a problem with the organization, he has a problem with doctors?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. What I can assure the member opposite is that as I toured the province, Mr. Speaker, talking to healthcare professionals from his community, from Sydney and Cape Breton all the way down to Yarmouth, Mr. Speaker, that this concern that is being raised by Doctors Nova Scotia is not the concern being brought forward by the doctors on the front line of our healthcare system, Mr. Speaker. That's when I make reference to this being a concern for the organization, not the physicians. That's what I was getting to, Mr. Speaker, and I stand by that statement that the concerns of the frontline healthcare professionals, those doctors that are providing the services to Nova Scotians from one end of the province to the other, their concerns are with the delivery of services, Mr. Speaker, and not a surplus account in Doctors Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Well, that confirms what we all thought, Mr. Speaker. This government is out of touch with the people that deliver the healthcare system in this province. Mr. Speaker, 100,000 Nova Scotians don't have a family doctor. And this government, they say they're doing all they can to attract doctors, and yet they're attacking the very organization that represents them in this province. Why is the minister saying one thing and doing the exact opposite by attacking the doctors he says he wants to attract?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the opportunity to highlight the great work that physicians from one end of this province to the other are doing, Mr. Speaker. I had the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to have a phone call with a physician, Mr. Speaker, in Cape Breton, works out of the Cape Breton Regional Hospital, just before coming down to the Legislature this morning, Mr. Speaker. And you know what? Not one of the 6 topics that we talked about on that phone call, Mr. Speaker, had to do with a surplus account held by Doctors Nova Scotia for the benefits being provided, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
These physicians, Mr. Speaker, are concerned about how we can improve the delivery of healthcare services for Nova Scotians from one end of the province to the other. That's what this government is committed to doing, Mr. Speaker. That's what the department and our health authorities and the frontline healthcare workers, physicians, nurses, and all healthcare professionals, Mr. Speaker, are committed to on behalf of all Nova Scotians. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. Yesterday, we learned that a very knowledgeable expert, Dr. Avis Glaze, has been hired to conduct an education system administrative review. Say that 3 times fast. We were told that the report from Dr. Glaze, who will remain based in British Columbia, could be expected on New Year's Eve. Both Dr. Glaze and the minister said they were coming to this review with an open mind and were interested in listening to all stakeholders. Mr. Speaker, given the need for extensive regional consultation on this issue, how does the minister expect the report to be completed within the proposed timeline?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In fact, it was Dr. Glaze herself who had suggested she would be able to meet the timeline that our government had suggested. She's a very dedicated person who brings a wealth of experience and knowledge to this, and I know that Nova Scotians, our education system, are going to be greatly benefited from her work in this province on this file.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, in this government's first mandate, they commissioned the Freeman Report, which made recommendations in 2015. The final report from the Commission on Inclusion is due in March 2018. Extensive consultations on pre-primary will begin in the next few weeks, and as we just discussed, Dr. Glaze's report is due on December 31st of this year. We were told in estimates that there's no money currently budgeted to address the findings from all these reports and consultation. Many, if not all of which, will have significant cost implications. Mr. Speaker, will the minister explain why his department is taking such an uncoordinated approach to such serious issues?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
In fact, Mr. Speaker, this is a comprehensive and coordinated approach to education. Everything we're doing is geared towards student success and achievement. We're looking at the model of inclusion, which has created challenges in our education system. We are looking at the classroom conditions that teachers have told us take away from their time to teach. And we're looking at early education, which we know is absolutely critical to student success. And of course, Mr. Speaker, it's incumbent upon us to look at ourselves and how we administer that system. We're doing all these things because we have high ambitions for our children and want to make sure that our government in every aspect in this department is doing its very best for them. Thank you.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. Mr. Speaker, a newborn in my constituency is facing a serious challenge as she requires a hypoallergic elemental baby formula due to severe allergies. This specialized formula, Promino A, costs more than $1,500 a month. This young family has been working hard to cover their bills, but the cost is simply too expensive. The family has asked the province about available programs, and I've inquired with the department and other sources. The family has even started a GoFundMe page to help cover the costs for the baby girl. And I sent the minister an urgent letter about this case in August. My question for the minister is, will the minister commit to looking into this case?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for bringing the question forward. As the member noted, I did receive correspondence from him earlier, and I have directed the department to look into it. I'll certainly double check what the status of that is, Mr. Speaker, and, but it's certainly my expectation that someone's been back to them, but I'll certainly follow up to make sure that that's been the case.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Thank the minister for that answer. Mr. Speaker, the infant's pediatrician has written a letter advocating on her behalf that the formula be funded, and I'll table that. In this case, the family has exhausted options at hand and still not found a single solution to the financial strife they face. If the family lived in HRM, they could get the formula from the IWK, and in fact, they have resorted to purchasing formula being sold on Kijiji by someone who received it through the IWK. Without the formula, the infant suffers intense vomiting, lack of weight, blood in her stool, and sleepless nights due to extreme discomfort. Will the minister commit, my question is, will the minister commit to providing this expensive formula to families outside the HRM with infants in desperate need?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, as the member mentioned, this is certainly a situation when the children of our province, indeed any citizen of the province that requires a specialized, whether it's in this case a dietary product or in some cases medication, that we want to do our best to support those individuals within our province. As I've already mentioned, I'd ask staff to look into this, Mr. Speaker, and I'll certainly follow up with them to see what the status of that review is, and certainly follow up with the family in this case.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. The 811 frequently asked questions webpage states that when a Nova Scotia Health Authority doctor, when the Nova Scotia Health Authority becomes aware that a doctor is taking on new patients, that it's the Nova Scotia Health Authority that gives the doctor the list of names for them to call. And I'll table that document. An article published in the Coast Guard News last week stated that a Dr. Noel Baker will be starting up his own wait list and drawing from it on October the 21st and not from the 811 list, and I'll table that document. Given that the Nova Scotia Health Authority's 811 distribution policy is to draw from its own list, can the Minister of Health advise me why Dr. Noel Baker in Barrington, Nova Scotia will be opening up a telephone application process for those without a physician where they're going to call in on October 21st from 1 to 3 p.m. or until 75 patients are registered?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. You know, the 811 system for tracking Nova Scotians who are looking to establish acquire a family provider, family physician or nurse practitioner to provide primary care services, Mr. Speaker. This is the first time we've had a coordinated list to be able to see across the province where the demand is, Mr. Speaker, so that we can facilitate for physicians and others providing primary care services that come into Nova Scotia to set up their practice to facilitate that process, Mr. Speaker. But again, if a physician was going to come to the province, Mr. Speaker, people have said from one end of the province to the other that they wanted to give the physicians flexibility, Mr. Speaker. I think that's what this situation is referring to.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Mr. Speaker, with all due respect, that didn't answer the question. Why is he drawing off of his own list and not the 811 list. And my constituents want to know, can they call and be seen, because they're also desperate for a family doctor. Once I saw the article, I actually called around to Doctors Nova Scotia, the Department of Health and Wellness, the Department of Family Practice, the 811 number, and the Nova Scotia Health Authority's concern line for family practice, and no one was able to explain to me why this was happening. They also weren't able to explain to me how a community is defined. So, Mr. Speaker, my question is, we register on the 811 list using civic address, and when the doctor sets up shop, they're going to call his community, but nobody can define community. Can the minister define for me a community and how people are drawn off geographically?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, I believe I had answered the first question, Mr. Speaker, when the member asked about the physician drawing their own list of people to draw from, Mr. Speaker. What we've said about the 811 system is that that's a list being identified so that we can provide to support and facilitate physicians, primary care providers, to establish a roster of patients, Mr. Speaker, to match. We think that's a service that's very helpful. In this case, the physician clearly has decided that for his practice it would be more preferable for his individual situation to draw from that list. With respect to providing the community list, Mr. Speaker, it is, as the member mentioned, geographically based. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, last week during question period, I asked the Minister about funding to help people living with MS to help travel to different appointments that they might have. And the Minister mistakenly mentioned a valuable program that assists people who have been diagnosed with cancer to travel away from home and to get treatment and supplies. So my question to the Minister, will the Minister clarify that there is no program to help Nova Scotians with MS for them to travel to their appointments?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do thank the member for giving me the opportunity to make that clarification for the House as well. Indeed, the member's correct. The program that I had referenced, I believe, is a limited program for cancer patients. That point was clarified for me by staff afterwards, so I apologize for that confusion, Mr. Speaker. So again, I'm glad to have the opportunity to correct the record. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for the correction. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned last week, Canada has the highest rates of MS in the world, and Nova Scotia is very high. No Nova Scotian should be prevented from receiving the MS treatment they need because they can't afford to travel to appointments. So, Mr. Speaker, my question is, will the Minister consider extending funding for MS patients in similar to what is available for Nova Scotians who have cancer?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for again raising this important issue on behalf of MS patients throughout the province. Very important, but indeed, I think the underlying question, I think perhaps goes beyond just any particular patients in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, that require perhaps specialized services or treatments that requires travel. Certainly, there are policies about supports that are available for out of province services and so on, Mr. Speaker. So it's certainly something worth looking into as part of government policies with travel within province when we do consider travel for specialized services outside of province.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. There are gaps in our healthcare system when it comes to treating complex PTSD cases that require inpatient care for military, first responders, and others, Mr. Speaker. Medical practitioners and advocates have approached the government and the former health minister about improving access to PTSD services in Nova Scotia. Inpatient mental health care over the past number of years have been replaced with outpatient care programs. There is a high cost of out-of-province treatment, which highlights the need, Mr. Speaker, for an inpatient care program here in Nova Scotia. So I'd like to ask the Minister, will the Minister update the House on when first responders and others will be able to access an inpatient treatment program for PTSD in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member for raising this question. Of course, as the member would know, Mr. Speaker, and you and all members know, I believe mental health concerns, including PTSD, is a topic of concern for all of us. We brought legislation here, Mr. Speaker, about presumptive access to workers' compensation in the session, Mr. Speaker, that all members are supportive of. So indeed, as a government, we're investing more into mental health supports and services for Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. So we'll continue that work for all Nova Scotians, and certainly with regard to the services of inpatient of PTSD sufferers. I know there's some requests out there about inpatient in Nova Scotia, but I believe actually the request that I'm familiar with, it talks more about an Atlantic access as opposed to necessarily just Nova Scotia.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
There are first responders who are receiving treatment outside Nova Scotia today, Mr. Speaker. People like Mark Long, a 15-year veteran of the Halifax Police Force, who was diagnosed with PTSD and who, as said, is currently in Ontario. I've spoken with Mark over the last little while, and he came forward with his case, Mr. Speaker, in hopes of improving how Nova Scotians with PTSD are treated and access to service, Mr. Speaker. The province needs to take care of those who put themselves, body and mind, at risk when they go to work every day protecting us, Mr. Speaker. We need to protect those who protect us. So I would like to ask the Premier, will the government commit to providing an inpatient treatment program here in Nova Scotia so Nova Scotians like Mark Young and others who are affected by PTSD can receive the treatment they need here in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member would know this is an issue he's brought to this House many, many times, and all of us are grateful for his previous profession, Mr. Speaker, when he responded to the needs of Nova Scotians as a paramedic in the province. This issue is a very serious one. It's one why we brought legislation to the floor that was quite frankly based on a piece of legislation the Honourable Member brought forward and was expanded in conversations with unions across the province to ensure we encompassed more first responders. The Honourable Member, Leader of the Opposition, has brought forward the issue around veterans and looking at PTSD around veterans. It's certainly an issue that we're looking at and seeing how can we provide a more comprehensive delivery model in around ensuring all of those who respond to the call of our country or respond to the call of our families on a daily basis who are suffering from PTSD get the treatment they can here at home. And we'll continue to work with that, and I'll make this pitch to you, and we'll certainly make sure that you are continually involved in the conversation that we continue to have as we provide that a more comprehensive delivery service, not only for those in the military, but those who respond to our families every day.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Transportation. Last week, the Minister clearly told me that the Cobequid tolls will not be removed once the debt has been paid, that the tolls would be kept on for commercial traffic. Mr. Speaker, I was elected to represent all the people of Cumberland North, including the business owners, who are paying a disproportionate amount of the revenue that's collected by these tolls, which is approximately $21 million a year. I've been patiently waiting for the financial reports from last year. They haven't been posted. My question to the Minister of Transportation is, when will the reports be made available to the public for the Western Alignment Corporation, which manages the Cobequid Pass?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from the Honourable Member. The province is in a position probably by 2019 to pay off the bonds associated with the Cobequid Pass. In terms of the current year, the annual general meeting occurred this week, and I would suspect that they would be forthcoming following approval by that body.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for the answer. The Minister also told me last week that he was not willing to increase the speed limit in the Wentworth Valley back to the normal rate of speed because it was part of the deal, quote unquote, with the bondholders. My question to the Minister of Transportation is, can he provide proof of this deal, this contract? Because in all my research, I've never been able to find where it's clearly written that the speed limit can't be put back to what it's supposed to be. That portion of the highway has extra, I think around 40 hours of extra police surveillance, and the people of that area are tired of this unfair speed limit to try to get people to use the pass. My question to the minister, will he give proof that his department cannot legally put the speed limit back in the Wentworth Valley to what it is supposed to be?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Well, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the question. I just want to say that the Western Alignment Corporation and the Cobequid Pass is a sterling example of the success of a P3 operation for all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. And the biggest value that Nova Scotians have reaped from those wise decisions to correct that safety problem we had was avoiding the extreme safety problems that were on the old section of road, which I had the pleasure of traveling for many, many years. So when you look at the success that has been associated with reducing the safety on the old road, it's really hard to criticize what has happened there. Mr. Speaker, thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is also to the Minister of Transportation. My office has received a number of calls in relation to the condition and lack of maintenance around provincial highways in the metro area. Residents are concerned about uneven road surfaces, potholes, and of course the damage that those will bring to their vehicles. Many constituents are particularly concerned about the state of the bridge located immediately off the 101 highway leading to the Magazine Hill. The bridge has recently dropped a few inches below the road surface and is on a sharp turn, Mr. Speaker. In addition to the questions about integrity of the bridge itself, whenever there's ice buildup or inclement weather, it also brings serious consequences. My question is, does the minister know when this specific bridge is going to be fixed, not just for the safety of the residents of Sackville and Beaverbank, but everyone who uses it?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the question, and thank you for bringing that particular structure to my attention. In Nova Scotia, the department maintains 4,300 structures and 24,000 kilometres of highways, and the most consistent and common complaint we have is about potholes. So we certainly do have lots of them, Mr. Speaker, across the province, and I'm so proud of the work that our 2,000 employees do every day to keep the integrity of our homes, our highways in the province. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And by no means is this a criticism of the employees that are hard-working. It's a criticism of potentially the government and what their priorities are around maintaining those roads. Mr. Speaker, I'm assuming that there is a 5 to 10-year capital plan that does outline and forecast capital projects. I'm wondering whether or not the minister would be able to forward that specific to the maintenance of the 100 series highways.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, to the member opposite, there is a 5-year capital plan which is being worked through currently, and I think that if you haven't already been consulted, you will be consulted about your riding and what particular projects did you see as a priority, and we'll certainly forward that into the mix.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
A question. I believe this one will be for the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia. I hear we're getting new driver's licenses. And, Mr. Speaker, the new process is going to involve people going in. Of course, they have to take the test first. That's right. But, Mr. Speaker, the person going in to renew their license needs to go in the way they've always done, but now they're going to have to wait, receive a temporary license and wait to get their official one mailed to them. Mr. Speaker, we know that, I understand that the company that is processing these new licenses is located in Ontario. Question for the Minister, has the government considered having these licenses made here at home in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I do thank the member for the question. This was an important one for public awareness, and the Minister of Transportation is heavily involved as well. This was an Atlantic procurement, so it was done in consultation with our sister provinces. And again, as the Minister alluded to earlier this week, the critical nature of this is the security, and there's only certain technologies that are done, and this was obviously applied by an open procurement. So from my understanding, this Ontario firm that bid on and was a successful bidder. It was the optimal place from a technology perspective, and of course from a cost savings perspective as well.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, Atlantic procurement in Ontario. We in the opposition would like to see it happen in Nova Scotia, but I am not going to comment more on that at this point in time. I know sometimes the capacity may not be here. Perhaps it can come here at some point. But Mr. Speaker, another question in the same matter. These licenses are supposed to have greater security features. Has there been, and this may be more of a question for the federal government, but I will ask it here, is there a chance that these new licenses can be used by Nova Scotians if they're wishing to cross the border into the United States? If these security features are enhanced, will there be any benefit to Nova Scotians in that regard?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do thank the member for the question again. That's certainly an ongoing part of the conversation. When we look at Service Nova Scotia and some of our efforts to bring in new technologies, really align our government functions and our government services with the digital age, part of the security is always the #1 priority, and it's the key with this particular license as well. But when you look further, when we try to draw online all the services that Nova Scotians have through their health information, all their driver's abstract, their driver's information, and the wealth of services that Nova Scotia have, it becomes about having one central identification for each Nova Scotian. So security is part of that, and it's a big aspect of it. So when we talk to our federal partners about what this means vis-a-vis passports, traveling over the border, it's all part of one overall decision to move towards that capability. So it certainly is an ongoing discussion, but we would like to utilize our license eventually to do just that at border services.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Business. Since legalizing cannabis, Colorado and Washington have each collected hundreds of millions in state taxes. Here at home, a CIBC report is suggesting that Canada's federal and provincial governments could reap as much as $5 billion annually in tax revenues from legalization. This revenue could be used to offset health, education, enforcement, and other costs resulting from legalization. That being said, we've heard very little from this government to date about the economic impact of legalizing cannabis here in Nova Scotia. So I ask the Minister, what economic analysis is his department undertaking to assess the legalization of cannabis, and when will this analysis be shared with the public?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Look, from our government's perspective and from the national government as well, the key focal point is safety, and how we're going to do this when it comes online in 2018 is really the focal point in terms of how we're going to protect Nova Scotians and all Canadians. We haven't done a deep dive economic analysis at this point. As we get into the discussions about how we're going to distribute and how the laws are going to be shaped and how the policy is going to work here in the province, we will have some of that information, but I think it's very troubling that there is a perception out there that this is going to be a cash windfall. But when you look at the ideas of enforcement, regulation, all the costs that are going to be associated, there's not going to be $1 billion sitting in a briefcase at the end of this process. Or anywhere. So we've got to make sure that we're giving accurate information to Nova Scotians to ensure that they understand that the focal point is about safety. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, with respect, I wasn't indicating I thought there'd be a stash of cash, more that I thought it would be appropriate to have an economic analysis at this time. Mr. Speaker, there'll be significant demand for cannabis once it's legalized. A lack of local supply will create a number of issues, including missed business opportunities, ongoing dependence on the black market, and the concern that those who use cannabis for medicinal purposes, importantly, may not be able to access this medication once it's fully legalized. There are only 35 licensed producers in the country and 0 in Nova Scotia. While there are 2 operations looking to get underway in Truro and Queens County, it's unclear how much of the province's demand will be met by production at these facilities if they are indeed approved. So I ask the Minister, with legalization of cannabis looming, what is he doing to allay concerns about lack of local supply that could result in lack of access for medicinal purposes and an ongoing dependence on the black market?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. There's 2 separate discussions here, Mr. Speaker. The stream that provides medicinal marijuana now will continue, Mr. Speaker. We have engaged our federal colleagues around the issue of demand. We've also engaged with Health Canada to determine when Nova Scotia can anticipate announcements relative to producers in the province of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musqueam Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Slow down. My question, Mr. Speaker, is for you. When am I going to get a chance to ask this question?
Tomorrow. Order, please. I'll pencil you in first thing tomorrow. The time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll